Okay, we are shifting today then to two topics. The first, a discussion of Polish-Jewish relations, because it is an essential background to discussing the possibilities and options of Jewish resistance. I mentioned earlier, in almost all cases of guerrilla warfare and resistance against occupation, those involved with it constantly talk about the need to have the support of the population. Mao Zedong's famous edict about guerrilla warfare, the guerrilla fighters are the fish and the people are the sea in which they swim. Drain the sea or have no sea, you have no fish. And thus one of the great problems that faced Jewish resistance was that they were fish swimming in a different sea, that most of the population were non-Jewish, and that complicated tremendously any kind of prospect of Jewish resistance. So we want to talk first about Polish-Jewish relations and then on to the implications of that, particularly in Poland and Eastern Europe for Jewish resistance. And once again, to note that this is a very sensitive topic, one that has aroused a great deal of emotion and still does today. In Poland and among Jewish survivors, it still remains a kind of open wound. I have certainly been at group discussions where survivors are present and heard at least one or more of them proclaim the reasons why they put the death camps in Poland is that the Nazis knew the Poles would welcome there and support them there and provide the comfortable environment in which to carry out the mass murder of the Jews. We have absolutely no evidence whatsoever that that is why the Germans put the death camps in Poland. They put the death camps in Poland because half the victims of the Holocaust lived in Poland. It's the shortest train ride. This was a logistical issue. It was not one based upon German estimates of Polish hostility towards Jews. But that gives us a sense of certainly how many survivors feel that they were not only isolated, but in some cases even betrayed by their neighbors. On the other hand, I've been in meetings involving Poles who are extraordinarily incensed at the notion that they are classed as co-perpetrators. They view themselves as one of the great victims of World War II, occupied by Hitler, occupied by Stalin, and who split the country and then conquered entirely by Germany and then conquered entirely by Stalin. Speaking of bad luck, getting double occupied by the two greatest dictators of the first half of the 20th century ranks up there as national catastrophe. Certainly, they suffered greatly themselves, and they view themselves as a major victim of what went on, and a victimization that has not been fully recognized because of the inordinate attention given to the Holocaust, that their suffering has been eclipsed, ignored, and even worse, to add insult to injury, that they have been classed as co-perpetrators instead of co-victims. So this is a topic in which both Jewish survivors and Poles have a huge emotional investment, in which often there is more heat than light when discussing it. So I do want to alert you to the fact that while we work our way through this, this is an area that has lots of emotional landmines and that we should be, I'll try to help to make sense of that and hopefully provide a way that we can wade through these two very different memories of the past, different ways of evaluating the past, and how, as an historian, one tries to come to grips with that. So let's go back to the early background of Jews in Poland. Jews had been centered in Western Europe during much of the Middle Ages, but we had seen that many countries expelled their Jews. One place that they could go to and be relatively welcomed was Poland. That here you had an area that was being colonized by people coming from Western Europe moving east, and it was a society comprised mostly of landowners on the one hand and the peasants working the land on the other. And many of the landowners certainly wanted to add a more sophisticated town life, invited Jews to come as merchants and craftsmen and artisans to fill in occupations that nobody else was filling. They also often became agents of the landowners in terms of the stewards who would manage the properties and so forth. But initially, Jews came to these areas to provide complementary economic functions, to perform duties that other people weren't doing. And the result was that there wasn't direct economic conflict, but it also meant that you had increasingly skewed profiles, that the vast majority of Jews lived in towns and villages, the vast majority of Poles lived in the countryside, the vast majority of Poles lived by agriculture, the vast majority of Jews lived by other ancillary occupations, serving the agricultural population, but not engaged in working the land themselves. In the course of this, the Jewish population in Poland, in fact, experienced a kind of population explosion in the 17th and 18th centuries. I think we can say the demographic center of European Jewry moved from Western Europe to Eastern Europe in the course of the early modern period. That the densest Jewish populations in Europe were in Poland, what was then Western Tsarist Russia, Ukraine, the Baltic states, certainly by the 18th and 19th centuries, and remain that until the Nazi assault upon them. So demographically, this is a place where Nazi population grew very considerably, where they had carved out, one might say, a life that was alongside, but not necessarily together with, the non-Jewish or Gentile population. By the late 19th, early 20th centuries, what had been a sort of a complementary relationship began to take on more one of conflict. And this can be, I think, attributed to a number of factors. One, by the 19th century, Europe is becoming more and more nationalist in its consciousness. Many of the populations in the multinational empires of Eastern Europe were becoming aware of their own national ethnic identity, their own language, their own culture, and viewing the need to be able to express and assert that. Certainly the Tsarist Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and to some extent the German Empire in the sense that it had Polish territories in the east, all were multinational. Those you had lots of populations that were not of the same language and the same ethnicity of the ruling dynasty. And that this led, to say, increasingly to an awareness by the late 19th century as the notion of nationalism spread from West to Central to Eastern Europe, increasing the expression of this, a feeling that somehow life was not complete if we didn't have a more adequate way of representing and asserting one's national identity, particularly, at least on some part, even through the desire to be free of multinational empires and to have one's own state. That this certainly was all the ultimate expression of Woodrow Wilson among the 14 points, self-determination, that people of a particular nationality should have their own nation state. This is what Western Europe had, what Germany and Italy had acquired in the 19th century in their unification movements, what required Italy and Germany to unite many small states into big Italian and German states. In Eastern Europe, on the other hand, required the opposite, the dismantling of international, multinational empires in order to allow the various groups within them to have their own nation state. And that was a very different dynamic. Uniting various Italian and German states into Italy and Germany is very different than dismantling Tsarist Russia and the Habsburg Empire into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Croatia, and so forth is a very different way of realizing this. So for Poland, they were part of this movement. And part of this movement aggravated even more because, in fact, Poland had disappeared from the map of Europe more recently. At the end of the 18th and early 18th century, basically the three big empires, Germany, Tsarist Russia, and Habsburg Empire, carried out a sequence of partitions of Poland That is, they couldn't agree with one another on much things, but they could all agree as they wanted to expand, and they could agree on cutting up Poland into various pieces and each sharing a piece. And there was a series of partition agreements, the last of which Poland simply disappeared from the map of Europe. So you have a Polish-speaking area with growing Polish national sense of its own identity in a recent history in which Poland had disappeared from the map of Europe and was not its own independent state, but conquered and divided and ruled from abroad by three different multinational empires. So that is a kind of chip on your shoulder nationalism. Not only is it nationalism wanting expression, but nationalism with a grievance that they have been mistreated and this needs to be undone. The question then, in a sense, if you're going to get a new Poland, what would that new Poland be, and what does it mean to be Polish? What is the definition of being Polish? And increasingly, the notion of what is Polish means to be Polish-speaking, to have Polish culture, and to be Catholic by religion. And that therefore, in this growing consciousness of what it meant to be Polish, Jews were not included. And that they are increasingly seen as an outsider living there, but not belonging there. And so emerging Polish nationalism, defining itself by both language and religion, had no place for Poles, or for Jews, who spoke Yiddish rather than Polish, and who were Jewish by religion rather than Catholic. So they were the archetypal outsider, alien, living in the midst of Poland, that were a minority that was seen not as belonging, even though they had lived there now for hundreds of years. At least in the part of the most aggressive and most aggrieved nationalists, Jews were not part of the future of what a restored Poland would be. A second source of conflict was the fact that as Poland modernized, more and more Poles moved into the middle class, moved into towns, moved into cities, and began to take up the same kinds of economic roles that Jews had previously had to themselves. That they become industrialists, they become businessmen, they become merchants, they become professionals, and towns that had been often 80 or 90% Jewish will now be 50% Jewish. And that you have a situation now that what had been a complementary economic relationship becomes a competitive economic relationship. So that the strains and tensions between a Polish minority, which constituted over 10% of the population, a very significant minority, is now increasingly being felt, in a sense, as Poland both modernizes economically to some extent, urbanizes to some extent, and certainly is feeling a growing nationalistic consciousness, all of which, in a sense, leave Jews out as both the alien and the competitor. So by early 20th century, what had been a fairly, I might say, a relationship of coexistence, living side by side but not together. To say, each with different languages, different religions, but nonetheless inhabiting the same space side by side, now increasingly one in which that relationship is one of tension, and for the majority, the minority seen as not belonging, as not having a future in that country. The man who perhaps most spoke for the sharpest, most radical expression of Polish nationalism was a man named Dmowski, and he becomes, in a sense, as I said, man articulating an aggrieved Polish nationalism, and an exclusive Polish nationalism is going to be very much at the fore. So Polish nationalism, let's say, both aggrieved and exclusive, will be one in which Jews are increasingly not at home in what had been their home for many centuries, where up to this point their numbers had grown very rapidly, and they had lived in relative coexistence with the populations around them. The political movement that Dmowski founds are the Index, so they are the ultranationalist party in Poland by the late 19th century. World War I breaks out, and one of the major casualties of World War I are the multinational empires. Certainly, the war starts when you have an ethnic conflict in what was Serbia on the one hand, and the Austrian-held and annexed territories of South Slavic peoples, particularly what was now presently Bosnia and Croatia, and it was Serbian, what by Serbian standards were Serbian national freedom fighters, and by Habsburg Austrian standards were Serbian terrorists. This is often the way that relationship works. Helped to trigger the war. As Gavril Princip comes from Serbia, trained and armed, shoots the heir to the throne of the Habsburg Empire. Austria makes demands on Serbia. The Russians back Serbia. The French, support their ally Russia. The Germans support their ally Austria, and the alliance system simply drags everybody into a war. If you go to Sarajevo, you can find the museum to the freedom fighter Gavril Princip. If you go to Vienna, you can go to the Imperial War Museum and see the open car where the martyrs of terrorism, the Archduke and his wife, had perished, and that different reading of that episode, either a martyr of terror or a great freedom fighter, you can still see in the two competing museums in Sarajevo and Vienna. In any case, once the war started, the cost of fighting a total industrial war in the 20th century proved too much for both the Habsburgs and Tsarist Russia. They both collapse, and that Wilson, with coming in and bringing in America to both make the world safe for democracy and to ensure this is the war to end all wars, tries to found a new international order based on self-determination. It was Wilson's idea that conflicts between ethnicities whose legitimate aspirations aren't realized are what trigger conflicts like World War I, and therefore these multinational empires should be broken up and people should get their own nation states. So you have at the end of World War I, the birth, and very explicitly in one of the 14 points, is the recreation of an independent Poland with access to the sea. That was an American war aim, specified by Woodrow Wilson. And the only way to give Poland access to the sea was through territory that had formerly belonged to the German Empire. So part of the Versailles Treaty amputates territory from Germany and gives that as the access that a recreated Poland will have so it can get to the Baltic and the port of Danzig. And in addition, there are all sorts of other new states. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania are created. Ukraine attempts to gain independence but does not succeed. It's reconquered by the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War. The various South Slav states are formed into a union of Yugoslavia. The Czechs and the Slovaks together, Czechoslovakia, get independence, but not separately. And so a whole group of new states, grow up in Eastern Europe, and Poland being the most radical of these in the sense that it comes out of not having existed at all and having been partitioned just a century earlier by all of its surrounding multinational empires. The dilemma the Poles face in being recreated and also fighting a border war with the Bolshevik regime in Russia and driving the Bolsheviks back and establishing a border further east than would have, if they hadn't won that war, is that not only is Poland recreated, but Poland is recreated containing minority populations that are close to 40% of its total population. So 10% of Poland is Jewish, but you have a very large Ukrainian minority, a very large Belarusian minority, a very large German minority. So that Poland, in a sense, went from not being there at all, but to being the new multinational state that thinks of itself as a single nationality in which these unwanted minorities are there. They want the territory. They don't particularly want the people, but they would prefer the territory, even if it means having these unwelcome nationalities among them. So Poland, between the wars, becomes the new multinational state of Central Europe, but one that behaves and conceives and thinks of itself as a nationalist realization of Poland and Poland's aspirations, and defines Polishness, as I said, as Polish speaking, Polish culture, and Catholic religion, even if large minorities in the country are not defined by that notion. So the question then is, in a sense, how is Poland going to maneuver through the interwar period in state building? How do you build a new Polish state in one in which its self-image is of pure Polish and its reality is one in which you have large minorities? The Dmowski answer was that you basically would rule solely in the name of Poles. But the man who in fact did emerge and tries a less radical approach to all of this was a man named Pilsudski. Pilsudski had been a war hero of World War I, creating a Polish legion that helped to give Poland the standing for its independence. And he is the ruler of Poland from basically 1919 to his death in 1935. And what he tries to do is engage in a kind of what you might call political log rolling or political bargaining. If the various minorities will basically let the Polish majority, as represented by Pilsudski, rule as Polish and recognize it as that, he will grant them cultural autonomy and ruling their own affairs as long as they go along with and accept the new Poland as Polish and not as, in a sense, multinational. So they carve out a series of deals with the various nationalities, including the Jews, that Jews can have their own, after public school, they can have their own religious schools, they can have their own Jewish community organizations that will run Jewish affairs in the various towns, as long as the Jewish vote goes to a political party, a Jewish political party that supports Pilsudski's coalition. So in a sense, he's buying political support in exchange for cultural autonomy, and it is a deal that gave Poland a relative degree of stability in the period while Pilsudski reigns. And he was dealing mostly with more conservative Jewish political parties who didn't aspire to their own kind of more aggressive representation. And it also led ultimately to him becoming more and more of a dictator. That is, Poland had, like most East European countries, started out with a democratic constitution, and like virtually every country in Central Europe, under the strain of nation building and then the Great Depression, democracy collapses and authoritarian governments take their place. And Pilsudski didn't have to be overthrown. He simply presided over the transition from a relatively democratic government to a more autocratic one, with him continuing in the driver's seat. In a sense, he did in Poland what Hindenburg dreamed of doing in Germany, but had no possibility of doing, and ended up putting Hitler in the driver's seat for the end of German democracy instead. So Pilsudski was often viewed then as a kind of friend of the Jews. He had good relations with the more conservative Jewish organizations and Jewish political parties. Within Poland, or what's to say within the Jewish community, there were other groups that were less positive about this arrangement. Certainly Jews who were now adhering to Zionism, a notion that Jews too should have their own national movement and their own state, their own country. The historic place for that was where they had previously had a state several millennia earlier, back in Palestine. But there were many Europeans, Jews, who now began to think, we have no future in Europe, but we must organize and train here for an ultimate return to a Jewish homeland in Palestine. often mouthing what turned out to be an unfortunately very inaccurate statement that Palestine was basically an empty land, and Jews were people without a land, and Palestine was a land without people, and this would be a very peaceful, easy kind of transition, ignoring the fact, of course, that there were large numbers of Palestinians living in Palestine, and we live with the consequences of that today. But in any case, Zionism was one group that was becoming more assertive. You had Polish socialists who viewed themselves more close to socialist in their identity than to Jewish, and that worked with, in a sense, thought class was the basis of solidarity, not ethnicity, and wanted to work closely with the Polish Socialist Party. And thus were not part of the sort of conservative Jewish establishment. And increasingly, though still relatively small in Poland, the Polish Communist Party, which of course was loyal to Stalin and the Comintern in Moscow, in which very few Polish Jews were in the Polish Communist Party, but a fair percentage of the Polish Communist Party were made up of Jews. It's a very small group, and you can have those two existing side by side. Very few Jews were communists, but many communists were Jews, just because it was a very small party at this point. So you had many Jews that were outside, in a sense, the Pilsudski Agreement, but nonetheless still not as powerful as the old Jewish establishment. Pilsudski dies in 1935 and is replaced by a regime of the colonels that was referred to, which is even more authoritarian, but also very openly and overtly anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism becomes an official position of the Polish government with the death of Pilsudski in 1935. And henceforth, the government basically pursued two policies that they didn't pursue with great efficiency, but nonetheless would, at least in theory, establish that Jews did not have a future in Poland. One of these was that basically Jewish property was ultimately Polish property, that Jewish businesses had gained their whole stranglehold on the Polish economy in illicit ways, and for Poland to really be Polish, the Jewish position in the economy was going to have to be vastly diminished, if not ended, and that Poles would have to rule and own, in a sense, the businesses in Poland and so forth, and so that they were fostering, for instance, boycott movements, don't buy at Jewish stores, and various laws that were passed that made it more difficult for Jewish businesses to compete, such as mandatory Sunday closings. All Catholics, when Polish Catholics were not going to have the business open, but Jews were going to close on the Shabbat from Friday night to Saturday night, and normally had been open on Sunday. Now, if you have forced Sunday closing, of course, Jews are off business 2 days a week against their Christian competition, which is closed 1 day a week, and you tilt the scales by that kind of law to basically advantage Polish businesses at the expense of Jewish-owned businesses. That was just one example of a number of kinds of measures the regime passes to tilt the economic table, to make it more difficult for Jews in Poland to compete and to sustain themselves in a very difficult economic time. The 1930s, of course, in Poland, like everywhere, is a period of the Great Depression. And ultimately, it was the stance of this government that they favored Zionism. Yes, Jews should move out of Poland, should go back to Palestine, that this is not their homeland is elsewhere, and thus, in a sense, theoretically, in terms of declared aims, the whole goal of the regime of the colonels in 1935 to 39 was basically one supporting the slow removal and self-removal of Jews from Poland through the surrender of their businesses and property and a move elsewhere, presumably to Palestine. What this also sanctioned was all sorts of increasing hostility in terms of relations in everyday nature. Jews going to universities were told they had to sit in the back of the classroom, and they also imposed what was called it was a quota, that Jews had been, certainly as urban people, overrepresented in universities, and now laws were passed limiting Jews to certain numbers in terms of entering classes in universities and schools, so that there was also in this way an attempt to ultimately break the Jewish preponderance in the professions. If you limited their access to law school and medical school and so forth within a generation, then the practice of law and medicine and other professions would pass from Jewish to Polish hands. So this was a long-term vision of how to basically end Jewish presence in Poland, and it also turned a blind eye to thuggery, to street violence against Jews, to local pogroms, which could be carried out with more or less impunity without repercussions from the Polish police. Open season, one might say. Almost every Jewish survivor who talks about his childhood in Poland this period, getting home from school, running the gauntlet of taunts and stone throwing and whatever, is still vivid in their mind as how this was turned into a hostile environment in which they did not feel safe. 1939, of course, comes the outbreak, the looming war, and then the outbreak of war with Germany. A very brief period in which Poles and Jews realize they have a common cause, and there is this sort of brief rapprochement to defend Poland against the greater threat. But the speed, of course, with which Germany conquers Poland in the West, and then with 17 days after the German invasion, Stalin and the Russians invade from the east and take their half of Poland, is going to create a situation that is going to be catastrophic for Polish-Jewish relations. One is, of course, that when the Russian army enters from the east, the Red Army enters from the east and occupies half of Poland, for Poles, this is viewed as the greatest of all disasters. The Germans come, but eventually the French and the British are going to defeat the Germans. They could see German occupation as temporary. If the Russians come and occupy eastern Poland, who is ever going to chase them out? This is an even greater long-term threat, and therefore, while they can see themselves surviving a German occupation in western Poland, they see the Red Army and communization of eastern Poland, which Stalin begins to carry out very rapidly, as an even greater catastrophe. The Jewish population in Poland, of course, reads that event in exactly the opposite way. For Jews in Poland, who is the greater threat? A communist regime that says class is the basis of what you do and race is insignificant, or the Nazis who think Jews are the greatest enemy in the world that must be destroyed. Clearly, for Jews, the Nazis are by far the greater threat, and that in Western Poland, some 200 to 300,000 Jews flee to the east, voting with their feet that they prefer to live under a communist regime of Joe Stalin than under a Hitler occupation. And in the east, many Jews, of course, breathe a huge sigh of relief that it is not the Nazi army that is arriving, it's the Red Army. And they welcome the Red Army coming as a protection against what seemed to be the imminent arrival of the Nazis. Remember, the first 17 days of that war, the Russians weren't in. And there was no very great prospect was the Nazis were going to occupy the entire country. And suddenly comes deliverance. The Red Army comes to occupy eastern Poland, and some places where the Germans had actually arrived, they have to back up and retreat to get to the preordained demarcation line. And communities that had a brief experience of Nazi rule find the Nazis withdraw, and the Red Army moves in, which for them is a matter of great relief. So you have Jews in eastern Poland welcoming the Red Army, you have Jews in western Poland fleeing to the east, and you have Poles witnessing this as totally incomprehensible and an absolute proof of Jewish betrayal and the fact that Jews are not Poles. Jews have an utterly different agenda, and now basically proving what had always been the right-wing claim, Judeo-Bolshevism. Jews basically are Bolsheviks in disguise. They're all communist sympathizers. And that for Poles, Jewish behavior is not seen as a understandable reaction to a very different threat they face than Poles face, but seen as a fact that Jews are not Poles, don't act like Poles, act like enemies of Poles, and must be condemned as enemies of Poles. So you have two very utterly different, both understandable, but two utterly different conflicting reactions to two very utterly different threats that the two groups face. Beyond that, when the Red Army comes in, they, of course, throw out many of the Polish officials that had ruled in these areas. Many of these areas, in fact, Poles had ruled as a minority, and install Ukrainians and Belarusians and Jews. Jews now can occupy positions in eastern Poland, in the newly Stalinized part of eastern Poland, that they had been excluded from by the Polish regime up until then. Suddenly you can walk into the post office and find a Jewish postmaster. You can walk into school and find a Jewish teacher. How unheard of. So for many Jews, in fact, the occupation by the Red Army is opening up social mobility and opening up positions that had previously been exclusively reserved for Poles and from which Jews had been banned. Stalin immediately starts to, in fact, carry out a Stalinist revolution in these areas. But for Stalin, the enemy, of course, is the class enemy, the capitalist. He's not hunting Jews, he's hunting capitalists. Now, Jews had a predominant position in the economy. So, in fact, many Jews have their businesses taken away. And when the Soviet police move in and begin arresting long lists of people that are viewed as potential enemies, we now know, though this wasn't clear at the time, that Jews were arrested and deported to Siberia by the NKVD in greater proportions than the Polish population itself. Not as Jews, but as capitalists. That they were viewed as coming from the wrong class and not able to adjust to and be trusted in the new social order that the Red Army and the communists are building. And so one portion of the Jewish population, those that had been relatively prosperous Jewish businessmen, are going to suffer greatly. But the rest of the Jewish population not only is not targeted, they have new opportunities open to them in terms of jobs and positions they had been excluded from previously. For Poles, all of this is again seen as Judeo-Bolshevism. Jews have welcomed them. Jews are entering positions they hadn't had. Jews are traitors to Poland, helping and becoming the mainstay of the communization, of the Stalinization of Eastern Poland, and that they should never be forgiven for this. So the way in which the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact works out not only seals the end of Poland in the sense that it's partitioned between the two, but it also has a horrific impact, an absolutely lethal impact upon Polish-Jewish relations because of the different way in which the two populations react differently to the Nazis and to the communists in the respective halves of the country. All of that, of course, comes on top of what one historian has called both attitudinal consistency, continuity, that is, the official anti-Semitism of the Polish regime before 1939, the Nazi official anti-Semitism often is seen as simply pursuing overlapping goals. It had been the goal of the Polish regime to basically Polonize Jewish property. The Nazis come in and begin to do it much more quickly and much more efficiently and allow some of the spoils to fall into Polish hands. Poles will be benefactors of the confiscation of Jewish property and the impoverishment of Jews in the Nazi-held parts of Poland. And this is seen by many of them as simply the Germans accomplishing what the Polish government had proclaimed as a legitimate goal, but which they had been too inefficient, insufficiently ruthless to do on their own, but what the Nazis will do for them, what they couldn't do and hadn't done so far. It had been the Polish goal eventually to separate Jews from Poles, and that Jews should eventually leave. What do the Nazis do? They come in, they separate the population by ghettoization, and they at least proclaim the goal of moving the Jews out of the country to some reservation elsewhere, again, to accomplish the creation of a Poland free of Jews that the 35 to 39 regime had proclaimed as a goal, but had made virtually no progress towards achieving. So you have a situation where the unrealized goals of the pre-war regime are suddenly being realized by the Nazis, and from which many Poles are the direct beneficiaries, particularly in the handing out of and redistribution of Jewish property. The Germans skim the big things for themselves, but when Jews are forced to leave their various houses and residences and businesses to move into a ghetto, much of that property goes into the hands of their former Polish neighbors, who now have a stake in preserving that redistribution. We know that the Polish underground had ties with the Polish government in exile in London, and the Polish government in exile in London basically tells the Polish underground, you should be proclaiming that all of these Nazi measures will not be permanent. Nobody should recognize these as legitimate, and they're formed by the Polish underground. There's one thing that is never going to be undone, and you better get used to it, because no underground is going to prosper in Poland if it takes up the cause of undoing what has happened, and that is the transfer of property from Jews to Poles. No government is going to be able to garner popular support who wants to return property to Jews that Poles have now attained. So that becomes a kind of key issue, and one in which gives the Nazis leverage, in a sense, of making many Poles the beneficiaries of their persecution of the Jews. In addition, at this point, it isn't very clear, and many Poles begin to also make the argument that Poles have it off worse than the Jews in Western Poland. When the Germans come into Poland, they appoint Jews as head of the Jewish councils and tell the Jews to run your own affairs. Take orders from the Germans, but run your own affairs. On the other hand, they carry out a policy of the systematic extermination and arrest of Polish intellectuals and Polish leaders. There's to be an erasure of Polish nationalism. One measure of that is either to murder or to arrest and put in concentration camps anybody that was viewed as a carrier of Polish nationalism, of Polish identity. Jews, they put into the ghettos and insist, they're held there and later they'll be sent away. Poles are rounded up for slave labor and shipped off to Germany. No Jews are taken from Poland to Germany. Poles are. As forced labor. So for many Poles, they rationalized, in fact, that Poles have it worse under the Nazis than Jews do, and the Jews are complaining, we're not there's no reason for worrying about what's happening to Jews. We've got to worry about what's happening to us, and we're getting it worse, in fact, than the Jews are. So you had a world, in a sense, in which Poles and Jews lived in very different circumstances, reacted to those circumstances in very different ways, and that all of those led to a growing chasm, really, between the Jewish population and the Polish population. Come 1941, of course, then Germany breaks the non-aggression pact, attacks Stalin and the Red Army, and quickly occupies eastern Poland, arrives in eastern Poland in the summer of 1941. This is to the east of the non-aggression pact demarcation line, and trailing with the German armies are, of course, the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile firing squads. They're going to be beginning to carry out the mass murder of Jews. And some of the very first towns in which major massacres take place before these groups even reach pre-war Soviet territories are, of course, territories in eastern Poland. But what also happens, and happens because it is intended Nazi policy, is the sparking of pogroms, of sparking and instigating of public anti-Jewish violence. We have the document from Reinhard Heydrich, the man who, Himmler's deputy, the man who helped organize the Einsatzgruppen. In early July, that is just a week after the outbreak of the war, he sends out to all of the Einsatzgruppen that it will be Nazi policy to encourage and instigate anti-Jewish violence, but to ensure that it has the appearance of spontaneous outbreak by the local population, and no trace or fingerprints of German instigation are to be left. This is all to be done without the German role being revealed or done in public. This is all to have the appearance that Poles have risen up in mass to take their revenge on the Jewish Bolsheviks, and that this is a spontaneous indigenous reaction to the prior Stalinization of this territory, in which Poles are taking their revenge on the evil Jews. So it is Nazi policy to instigate pogroms, and a number of anti-Jewish riots do break out in eastern Poland. One of these was in a town called Jedwabne, and has had a very important book written about it by the Polish-American historian Jan Gross. Jan Gross now is retired, but he was at first at Emory and then at Princeton. At the end of the 1990s, he wrote a book called Neighbors. And it was a study of what happened in the town of Jedwabne in early July, shortly after the Germans swept through these areas. And in that, he makes the argument that basically, as he put it, one half of the town killed the other half of the town. The Gentile population murdered the Jewish population in Jedwabne. And that much, I think, seems fairly clear. There was a huge amount of dispute, however, about some of the facts beyond the fact that there was a massacre of the Jewish population in Jedwabne. Was it German instigated? To what extent was it German instigated? This is still debated. How many victims did they get? Almost all the Jewish population, or did a fair number at least temporarily escape? The total number of victims is still under dispute. But it is clear that this was a case where the Poles in the town of Jedwabne did carry out a massacre of the Jews in that town. This had an absolutely electric effect in Poland in roughly when it came out about 2000, which we'll talk about at the end of this lecture, because there was then again a whole issue of, are Poles perpetrators or are Poles victims, or can you be both a victim of the Nazis and the Stalinists and be a perpetrator against the Jews? How does one sort out those various kinds of titles? But it certainly was an example of pogroms that took place and massacres, and it was in line with the Nazi policy of stirring up such things. The degree to which this particular town was one in which the Nazis stirred things up is still one of the contested issues by it. But thereafter, then, eastern Poland occupied by the Nazis and basically subjected to the treatment of Soviet Jews. So the killing begins in the summer of 41. Much of the killing is done by firing squad. To the other side of the demarcation line, of course, the mass killing will begin in early 42 and will be mostly done in gas chambers of death camps. So Poland remains, in a sense, partitioned by the relative ways in which the final solution is implemented. And right on the border, the Lublin district, as you saw in Battalion 101, there's in fact a mixture. 101 is not only carrying out massacres, but it is also putting Jews on the trains to Blinka. And in that area, it's a blended solution in which you have both mass shootings and deportation to death camps right along that demarcation line. What the onset of the final solution then did was in a sense raise sort of new issues. For Poles now, of course, the hope is that the Soviets have been chased out and that Poland will be liberated by the Allies defeating Germany, and Poland will be recreated and independent once again. The main threat to that recreation and reestablishment of an independent Poland would be the arrival of the Soviet army from the east before the arrival of an Allied army from the west. And so for them, in a sense, the longer the Germans remain deep in the Soviet Union and the longer the Germans are winning in the East, the better the prospect of Poles of being liberated from the West. And that's the long game. Jews do not have a long game. Jews are now, from 42 on, racing the clock. Can somebody come and liberate their country before they're all dead? So for Jews, the only real prospect of survival, of having anybody alive by the end of the war, is a rapid Soviet victory and the arrival of the Red Army to stop the killing before every last Jew in Poland has been murdered. So after 42, once again, there are two different groups reading the geopolitical situation and reading the changing military situation in utterly different ways. For one, the arrival of the Red Army is the greatest dread, the worst possible outcome. For the other, the arrival of the Red Army is the only hope, the only chance that anybody will be left alive before the Nazis have completed their murderous task. So this totally incommensurate reading of the situation and having an utterly different interest in how events on the Eastern Front transpire and what one thinks about the defeat and victory of the Red Army divide Poles and Jews even after the mass killing has begun. For one, the Red Army is permanent conquest. For the other, the Red Army is hope for liberation and salvation. For Jews, as they begin to contemplate resistance, the problem they face there is that the Polish resistance has also, once again, an utterly different timetable to operate by. For Jews, if they're going to resist, they're going to have to resist before everybody is killed. They're going to have to resist now. For Poles, the resistance strategy is the following. The only resistance they're going to take is one at the right window of opportunity to rise up against the Germans now when the Red Army, the German army is deep in Russia and the Germans are in total control, is an invitation to be defeated and crushed and have no one left to take the reins when the German army is finally on the verge of defeat. So for the Polish Home Army, the Polish underground, basically the rule is we do not want a premature uprising. We do not want somebody rising up against the Germans now. We must remain intact. We must keep our arms caches hidden so that at the point where the German army is on the verge of collapse, but before the Red Army arrives, in that brief window, we can rise up and reestablish a Polish state and be in control of our own country when the Red Army arrives, and we can basically have the poker chips, we have the position to reestablish a Polish state in that somehow nanosecond of a window of an opportunity between the German army on the verge of defeat and the Red Army not yet there. Therefore, anybody proposing to rise up now is going to ruin the game. For Jews, resistance can only make sense now. Waiting only means there'll be nobody left to rise up at all because there'll be no Jews left to resist. So there is no cooperation between the emerging Jewish resistance and the Polish resistance because they have absolutely different strategies and different timetables. Now, this has then led to all sorts of mutual accusation, in a sense, and certainly on the part of Jews, the claim that Poles could have done so much more to help that they didn't do. And the feeling that the Jews were abandoned, were left in isolation, and that their Polish neighbors left them to their fate without doing anything that could have been done that would have helped to save Jewish life. And lots of suggestions are made. I mean, Jews complained arms could have been given to the Jewish underground to at least help uprisings in the ghettos. Diversions could have helped prevent Germans from concentrating on crushing, for instance, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Above all, the railway lines to the death camps could have been sabotaged, and the death camps themselves. I mean, as we saw, Treblinka had 120 Ukrainian guards and 30 SS men. If there was ever a target ripe to be overrun, and it's way out in the boondocks, totally isolated from anything else, the Polish death camps could have been overrun in fairly small hit-and-run operations, the facilities destroyed, and at least temporarily be put out of commission. There certainly could have been, on the part, at least, of the Jews feeling that help in hiding could have been much more extensive. And above all, there could have been Polish pressure against and sanctions against Poles who informed on Jews who were in hiding. One of the great fears, in almost every Jewish memoir of somebody who survives in hiding, the great fears are the informants, the people that make a living by going hunting out Jewish hiding places, bribing them until they're out of money, and then turning them over to the Gestapo. That was a profession in Poland during the war. And that while anybody who had betrayed a Polish resistance fighter was eliminated immediately, people who were the denouncers and informers against Jews remained in business and suffered no particular sanction from the Polish underground because they weren't causing Polish victims. There was also claims much more information could have been given. The Polish underground is much more informed and could have shared information with Jews. So there's a whole series of complaints that Jews have made about the lack of Polish support, the lack of Polish help. On the other hand, of course, there was also, on the other side, the position that Poles did, in many cases, what they could. No population in Europe was threatened with as dire sanctions for helping Jews as Poles. That in Poland, unlike elsewhere, the people who hit Anne Frank, they were arrested and sent to a concentration camp in the Netherlands. In Poland, people helping Jews suffered the death penalty, and their family, collective punishment, suffered the death penalty. If you found a Jewish hiding place in a Polish farm, you simply killed the Jews and all the Polish family that had hid them. So that the Nazi policy towards Judenhelfer, as they called them, people who helped Jews, was more draconic in Poland than in other parts of Europe. And that the Germans did what they could to obviously snuff out any hint of cooperation between the two populations. They did their best to fan divide and conquer rather than anything that might have brought solidarity among the victims. There were Polish organizations that nonetheless did set out to help Jews, help hide Jews, and give them false identifications. Zagota was a Polish Catholic organization that was organized to basically find hiding places for Jews seeking to hide, find false IDs to give them papers to pass, find ways to forge ration cards so they had something to eat, and that thousands of Jews were hidden with Polish help, and that virtually any Jew that survived in hiding in Poland owed his or her survival to a large number of Poles. And the dilemma was it took large numbers of Poles to help one Jew survive. It took one Polish informer to bring down a whole bunker of hidden Jews. This was a asymmetrical, disproportional contest. That is, it was so much easier. You needed one moment of one day in which somebody makes one mistake and one informer can bring everything down, while it took 3 years of nobody making a mistake with multiple hiding places, multiple people giving support for one Jew to survive. So the difficulty of helping a Jew survive was so much greater than the ease with which individuals could denounce and inform on them and bring about their death, that this whole issue of hiding and denunciation, as I say, is a very asymmetrical contest. And certainly more Jews were killed in hiding than were saved. But the task of hiding and saving Jews was so much greater than that of turning them in and exposing them that it doesn't tell us what the proportions of the population were that, in a sense, were on those different ends of the spectrum. Some of the questions that then arise, in a sense, is, how important was Polish anti-Semitism to Polish behavior during the war? How important was Polish behavior to the survival or non-survival of Jews? The vast majority of Polish Jews are killed because of German power. They trap Jews in ghettos, they round them up in ghettos, they put them on trains, take them to death camps where Germans put them to death. And the real issue is how many more Jews might have survived who were in hiding that didn't, how many more Jews would have attempted to hide if hiding had not been so difficult and so precarious. And one can say more Jews could have been saved. One can always say more could have been done. There's almost no historical circumstance in which one can not say more could not have been done. But how much more could have been done is a question, I think, that we simply are not going to be able to answer in any kind of definitive way. When we look at the Thomas Blatt book, we'll see he, of course, goes through a period of hiding and some of the extraordinary threats and difficulties and challenges that he has to cope with. So do, I think, read that section with great care. What happens after the war also shapes the lens through which these memories are held. And I don't think we can really understand even, what today, the state of Polish-Jewish relations, if we don't add on a little bit about what happens after the war. After the war, a number of Polish Jews, we had said, had fled to Eastern Poland. 200,000 or 300,000 had fled to Eastern Poland. In Eastern Poland, they are given, in a sense, papers by the new Soviet regime, and they have to fill out their own self-proclaimed identity. If they fill out identity as Polish or Zionist, rather than as Soviet, they are put on the trains and sent to Siberia. To say, the largest block of people sent to Siberia by the Soviets proportionally are going to be Jews. Some of them are, quote, class enemy, and others are those viewed as not adapting to the new Soviet national identity. The largest number of Polish Jews that survived the war by virtue of having been sent to the Gulag in Siberia. Now that's a great irony, obviously, that you would prefer to be in a Stalinist camp than in a Nazi one, but in fact, you did survive the Stalinist being sent to Siberia. You did not survive being in the German ghetto. After the war, those people returned to Poland. Small numbers of Jews come out of hiding. Some Jews who had survived in the camps, labor camps, which we'll talk about later, and are marched into Germany at the end of the war, come back from Germany. And so a remnant of Polish Jewry, if some, arrives back in Poland, then several issues are immediately raised. And that their return to Poland is not welcomed. Their return to Poland is greeted, as the common phrase, the first thing you do is you go to your house. First of all, most Polish Jewish families had agreed they would go back to Poland trying to see who was still alive. When the families are separated and whatever, we'll come back to the hometown after this is over, and this will be our meeting place. So many Jews are coming back simply to see who in the family survived, who is still there. When they arrive, of course, the first thing they do is they go to their home. Somebody else is living in their home, and the standard thing they face is the homes are for Poles, the streets are for Jews. You can camp out, but you're not getting your house back. In addition, many Jews who had left had, as I say, property had been taken as the Nazis allowed them to. Some Jews had even given property to Polish friends to be held for them. And this was done until the Jews were deported. And for many Poles, this is then viewed as their inheritance. They took the risk of, in fact, helping Jews up until 44, 43. Now they view the property as their own. And out of all the people, their Jew happens to come back and wants his property back. They're bad luck. I mean, how bad my luck? Somebody was claiming this, what I've inherited. And so there's hostility there too. So property becomes immediately one issue. And the phrase that is current in Poland after 45 is formerly Jewish property. That's the term for it because it's assumed that it is never going to become Jewish property again. A second great fear about the return of Poles, Jews, is not only they're going to claim property, but that they're going to be sympathetic to the new communist-imposed regime. Clearly enough, they welcomed the arrival of the Red Army because that drove the Nazis out. Whether they will be continual supporters of a new communist puppet regime that is established is not clear, but in the assumption of Polish nationalists, that seems to be a given. And so Jews are viewed as a fifth column, viewed as the obvious collaborators or collaborators waiting to be collaborators of a communist-imposed regime. And therefore, you don't want Jews returning because Jews will ally with the communists and that they will be part of the political enemy imposing an alien foreign regime. And at least some historians have argued, in addition to the political question, assuming Jews will be pro-communist, the property question, assuming Jews will want their property back, there's also the factor that Jews will remember the behavior of their neighbors, that they will have a memory of behavior that many people would like to forget and don't want revived or thrown in their face. We'll see an example of that at the end of the Thomas Blatt book. And so for all of these, the Jews are witnesses to behavior Poles don't want anybody to witness or recover, and they don't want to give up property, and they don't want what they presume will be a pro-communist population. The welcome of Jews is a non-welcome, and in some areas a hideous vigilante killing. Poles that come back to some towns are murdered by Poles to scare the rest of them off. These are terror killings to try to drive returning Jews away. So you have this absolutely grotesque phenomenon where someone who has survived 5-6 years of the Nazis coming back to his hometown and being killed by his neighbor after the war. And that is not uncommon. Now, it wasn't great numbers, but the purpose was sufficient numbers that the Poles will flee en masse. And indeed, that's what happens. Between 1935 and 1945 and 1948-49, virtually all the returning Polish Jews leave, and the communist government is glad to see them leave. The only population that the Polish communist regime is not going to let Poles leave. But they're happy to see the Jews leave because they do not want to be put into the position of having to protect Jews. They're trying to be seen as Polish nationalists, do not want to be seen as protectors of the unpopular Jews, and therefore find the best way to solve this problem is to let the Jews leave. So you have nationalist Poles chasing Jews out, communist Poles welcoming their exit, and the Polish Jews basically flee Poland, and that Poland, by the late 1940s, basically the surviving Polish Jews have left and are either going to the United States or Canada or Australia or the British Palestine Mandate, or after 48, the State of Israel. And Poland basically had a minuscule Jewish population thereafter, and the communist regime did its best not to have that be part of Polish history. So from 45 on to the fall of communism, basically the Nazi killing of Polish Jews is a matter of official amnesia. That the communist regime is focusing on Nazi crimes against Poles, not on Nazi crimes against Jews, and that this is a chapter that simply isn't part of the official history. that if one went, for instance, to the memorial camp at Auschwitz, this is basically a museum and memorial to Nazi crimes against all Europeans, Poles in particular, and one little barrack was allowed to have a Jewish exhibit, mainly for foreign Jews sent to Auschwitz to be killed, but almost nothing about the fate of Polish Jews. The end of the Iron Curtain, the fall of communism, and the opening up of a non-communist regime, then becomes an issue of how will Poland deal with its past, and indeed how will Polish-Jewish relations and how will Poles remembering this and writing about this be worked out. And the answer is it has been tension and conflict. That older Polish historians have generally pursued the Polish national line. We were the prime victims, and we certainly weren't co-perpetrators against Jews. Younger historians have engaged in a remarkable degree of historical research, following and inspired by Jan Gross in book Jedwabne, done lots of work onto the fate, particularly of Jews attempting to hide, Jews in areas after the Germans leave, and the fact that Jews are still in precarious and in danger through the end of the war and after the war in Poland, that there was no respite. Up to the point that now that Poland has gotten a very right-wing nationalist government again, there has been a law passed in the Polish parliament that makes it against the law in Poland to attribute the crimes of the Nazis to the Polish nation. Any discussion of Polish co-responsibility, of Polish complicity in the Holocaust is against the law in Poland. The court cases testing that have not come to conclusion yet. That is, we don't know exactly how those are going to be ruled. What does it mean, the Polish nation? Does it mean any Pole that you name as having behaved badly and denounced Jews? Is it attributing to Polish authority? We don't know. But obviously the key goal of that law was to intimidate young Polish historians. Don't write on this topic. If you want a future career, do not go into researching Polish-Jewish relations in World War II. Because you will run afoul of the law. You certainly aren't going to get fellowships. You certainly aren't going to get a job. This is the signpost they are setting up. This is a dead-end career. Don't go there. But there are court cases looming in court, particularly for the Canadian historian Jan Gabrowski, who has, in a sense, purposely tested the limit. And he has written about what he calls the Jew hunts in Poland after the Germans leave, after they clear the ghettos, and what Polish collaborating authorities do on their own when the Germans are no longer present in continuing the search for hidden Jews. And comes up with some extraordinarily tragic stories that he documents. And what will come of that, we don't know. But this is a story which is still going on. That as the history wars over the history of the Holocaust in Poland is still very alive and very active in Poland today. Okay, I now want to sort of shift to the discussion of Jewish resistance, and particularly Jewish resistance in Poland, and its culmination in the single largest example of Jewish resistance, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in the spring of 1943. We had talked a bit about sort of the general background that mitigated against coming to a position and thinking about or arguing for the need for resistance. One of those arguments was the one, of course, that Raoul Hilberg had made that we had discussed, and that is past experience. The past experience seemed to have confirmed that the best way to survive was through alleviation and compliance, that armed resistance, physical resistance, generally fanned the flames of pogroms, fanned the flames of anti-Jewish violence, was counterproductive, and that hunkering down, providing a low profile, waiting it out, seeking the intervention of other authorities, got one past the violence quicker and minimized loss, while confrontation and physical resistance, as I say, sort of fanned the flames. So from that one part of what we deal with is simply the mindset in which armed resistance was not part of the culture, not part of the vocabulary, not part of the mindset with which Jews would approach the dilemma they face when the Germans arrive in 1939. A second very real factor, and perhaps even more important, was the reality of collective retaliation. That for any Jew to resist, they had to know, and the Germans made it perfectly clear, that they would not just punish the offender, they would punish the entire community. So for anybody to decide they were going to do something, ambush and shoot a German policeman or a German soldier, knew that they would be bringing down the wrath of the Germans on the entire community of massive retaliation, of collective retaliation. What that meant also in the community was anybody talking about resistance, raising the thought of resistance, arguing for the need for resistance, was seen as a dire threat to the community, a potential troublemaker, a potential lightning rod who is going to bring disaster down upon everyone else. So anybody broaching the topic of resistance is at least initially seen as a troublemaker, as a threat to the community, and therefore the Jewish community, in a sense, exercising a kind of collective discipline, working very consciously to ensure that nobody is organizing for resistance. They're trying to snuff out even the mention of it, the thought of it, as soon as they can, because collective retaliation was real. This was not a bluff. And they knew there were many Nazis just hoping for the pretext that would allow them to carry out mass attack on Jewish communities. That they knew they were facing, in a sense, not only collective retaliation, but a hair trigger. Many Nazis who simply couldn't wait for the chance, for the excuse, for the pretext, and therefore discipline, a calm, behaving oneself became incumbent upon Jews, particularly upon any potential hot-headed Jewish youth who might want to put his own ego and bluster ahead of the interests of the community. So collective retaliation, it was, to say, very real and very imminent and exercised a very powerful deterrent that both exercised on the individual who knew what he would be incurring if he acted, or she, but exercised by the community, which was determined that no one should bring down catastrophe, calamity on the community by some reckless acts that would bring the Germans down on everybody, and everyone would be punished for the actions of a single individual. Now, a third problem they had was lack of information. The Germans are not out to, of course, inform the Jews of where all of this is going. And it isn't until 1941 we've seen that the Germans even decide on a policy of systematic and total mass murder, that they certainly aren't sharing that turn in Jewish policy with the Jews, and all sorts of attempts at obscuring that, at hiding that reality are undertaken. In the larger ghettos, they always come in increments. We just need to lessen the population because they're all overcrowded and underfed. So you can make a plausible explanation, as we had seen in the Rumkowski speech. If we just give them one more batch of victims, then peace will return and all will normalize. That hope that each of these deportations is the last one, this grasping at the straw, that there will be an end point and a saving remnant, and the inability to get the confirming information to the contrary is part of this. And certainly the Germans are spreading disinformation as much as they can. And on the part of Jewish leadership that has put their bet on survival through labor, on a saving remnant through labor, not sharing with the wider community the information they ultimately do get. That is, at some point, people escape from the death camps, from Treblinka or Chełmno, return to the ghetto, explain what has happened to the deportees that have mysteriously disappeared. And even then, the leadership does not share this information with others. On the one hand, if they did, they fear that it will cause total chaos, and again, that will bring in the Germans to finish things off, will end playing for time, because if the Germans see that incremental deportation will no longer be complied with, this will bring about immediate liquidation of the ghetto. And for some, it was out of a kind of misplaced sense of humanitarianism. We all know, the issue if somebody has a terminal illness. Is it better to let the person live without knowing that a death sentence has been passed, or do you share with the patient the grim prognosis that they have terminal cancer and are going to die within X number of months? Certainly, some Jewish leaders took the position that it was a greater kindness not to share with the community that a total death sentence had been passed, to not want them to live their last months in the utter horror and anguish that they and their families were going to be murdered, and thus had felt that the withholding of information was a kindness, was a humanitarian thing to do, and took upon themselves to make that decision, which of course deprived the victims of the information they needed to make their own decisions about their own life. And even if it's dressed up as humanitarian, we know in the end that is a very unethical decision to have made. But nonetheless, we know that some did that. Particularly the chief rabbi of Berlin, Leo Beck, was very clear in saying that he chose consciously not to share what he knew because the suffering that people would live under in a situation he was hopeless to alter. And so why poison the last months of people's lives with this terrible information? So you had the fear of retaliation, the inability to kind of think outside the box, and the lack of information to make an informed decision that all mitigated against reaching the conclusion that the Nazis were engaged in a European-wide plan for total extermination. Only when you've reached that awareness, only when you realize that the Nazis are going to kill everyone anyway, does the illusion of survival through labor, does the illusion that you're avoiding collective retaliation then evaporate. They are seen to be illusions. That is, the threat of collective retaliation or the holding out hope by incremental deportations, when you realize those are scams, that everyone is going to be killed anyway, then those threats simply aren't there anymore. And then one can begin to think, what is the appropriate response in the face of a death sentence? What does one do when one knows that regardless of how we behave, regardless of how we act, regardless of what strategy or tactic we propose, the Germans are going to come and kill everyone anyway? So that not resisting has no benefit whatsoever, and that it therefore has to be considered. The confirmation that the Nazis in fact have a plan to kill everyone, that there is no strategy for a saving remnant, also comes frequently at the point when most young people's families have already been murdered. The last people taken are those who are the young, able-bodied, those that are still kept for work temporarily, and they are also now in a position that one might say is they're free, that they no longer are responsible for their family. They can risk their own life. They can make decisions for themselves without having to think, how do I take care of my parents? How do I take care of my baby sister? What would be the implications of that if I go underground, if I flee to the forest and join a partisan band? They are now free to take choices that the family ties made very difficult to take earlier, but as a free agent, they now are much more liberated to take. So all of those factors, in a sense, finally clear the decks and make it possible for people to think about and discuss and debate the appropriateness of resistance, the possibility of resistance, the different possible strategies and tactics of resistance, and that is, of course, the first step to resistance itself. But you have to go through all of that before you can actually begin the process of how do we resist, not just should we resist, until those other obstacles are removed. There are other obstacles that still remain in the way. That is, once you've decided resistance is a real possibility and you're entertaining whether it is the best track, and if so, how to do it, there are still various problems. One is the utter fragmentation of Jews between different political orientations and around what groups, what organizations are going to become the nucleus of resistance. The Jews in the Communist Party were still working within and operating within communist directives, did not see themselves as part of a Jewish resistance, but saw themselves part of whatever the tactics of the Communist Party were. So they don't, in a sense, participate in a discussion about Jewish resistance because their identity really is elsewhere. The older political parties, the established political leaders, frequently now look not so much to resistance but to escape. How can at least the prominent leaders of the party, how can certain prominent rabbis be rescued, smuggled out? How can we have a surviving remnant by flight? That was one of the options that Hilberg put out. How do we hide away and manage to rescue a few key personnel that are in their particular groups? But in the end, the group that was most adequate to and most able to conceive of and argue for a Jewish resistance were the youth groups. And these were the Zionist youth groups. Those who had already been thinking in terms of national identity, had broken with, in a sense, traditional politics, and were not in the communist camp taking their directions from Moscow, that began and had remained intact, particularly in Warsaw, but in contact with their same youth group elsewhere through couriers and collecting information better than many others had done. So a number of these different youth groups, before the war, there were a whole number of Zionist youth groups, often that engaged in the most painstaking ideological debates, hair-splitting ideological debates. But it did mean that they were vibrant. It did mean that you had different members of each of these youth groups in different major cities in Eastern Europe, and that they could keep in contact. One area in terms of differing experience, couriers were almost invariably women because, of course, they could not be revealed by circumcision if they were stopped and searched. And so it was young Jewish women that kept the contact between ghettos, between youth groups in different cities, and shared and pooled the information that people were able to pool by this stage. So that the youth groups, both because they were now the least tied to tradition, the most, in a sense, free from thinking about a future in Europe, and had already committed themselves to severing themselves with a older way of life, that were most able to begin to talk about resistance. And even there, you had a great split between what was called the right Zionists. And these were the followers of a man named Jabotinsky, and this was a very conservative right-wing Zionist group, and a whole plethora of left-wing Zionist groups that were much more socialist in their orientation. And in the end, as we shall see, they both agree on resistance but not fighting together. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising will have two different armed groups of left and right Zionists that will fight parallel resistances against the Nazis, but so divided by their own ideological political stance that they do not agree to a common commander, a common policy, a common organization. So Jewish fragmentation, in a sense, continues even to the end. I mean, there's a lot of dark Jewish humor about this, that, if you have one Jew, you have 2 newspapers, 3 synagogues, and 4 political parties. This is just the fragmentation of Jewish life. The notion of there being a single world Jewish conspiracy is so at odds with the reality of Jewish fragmentation that they can make jokes about it. But in any case, it also had a reality, and it wasn't a joke, and that is one of the problems in moving to resistance is that differences between different Jewish groups persisted even in the face of the final solution. Another problem was strategy. Where and how would one resist? Some groups said young people should leave the ghetto, abandon everyone else there that couldn't go with them, flee to the forest, form partisan groups. That the ghetto is a death trap, the ghetto is an urban internment camp. Only in the forest and the swamps can you basically take up effective resistance, and that flight from the ghetto, which means, of course, insofar as you still have family or the rest of the Jewish community, you are leaving them to your fate. Even if you get to the forest, there is a debate between groups that form partisan groups, what is our prime purpose? Is it to kill as many Germans as we can, or is it to save as many Jews as we can? Now, some of you may have seen the movie Defiance, which was by the partisan group in Belarus that flees to the swamp lands there. And that the Bielski brothers basically decide on an option of building family camps. The object is to save Jewish lives. And there are other groups that argue, no, our object is to kill as many Germans as we can before they kill us. It is to exact revenge. So even fleeing to the forest, you still had 2 different orientations and 2 different priorities on those that left the ghetto. That's an option for people in areas where there are mountains and forests and swamps. And parts of Poland are in fact without that, and that there are areas of Poland where you can get to the forest. Certainly it was much easier to do that in Belarus and in the northern Ukraine. Much more conducive to people leaving the ghetto and finding partisan groups, much less conducive to do that in western Poland. And that if you, say, fled the ghetto in Warsaw, you had to make your way to the Parchev forests in northern Lublin district or something like that, or even better, get across the Bug River into the Ukraine and join some group there. But you had a perilous journey on top of the decision of trying to escape the ghetto in the first place. If you decided to fight in the ghetto, what does that mean? Basically, that is, as one historian put it, the revolt of the doomed. You are going to make a last stand knowing that there's no prospect of victory. You will just make it as hard for the Germans as you can, and that you will choose to die in the ghetto rather than be deported to a death camp and die in a gas chamber. Nobody can imagine that you're going to defeat the armed might of Germany in the ghetto uprising. So, in a sense, the very idea of resisting in the ghetto is an acceptance that the end will be death, the end will be that no one survives, but how you will meet that end and do it by fighting the Germans to the very end. There, too, again, we've seen there were disputes over timing. In Bialystok ghetto, Ephraim Barash supported an underground to create the means for resistance, but insisted that you have to wait until the final liquidation. As long as we can play out the clock in partial deportations, as long as there are hope of a saving remnant through survival through labor, you don't resist. When they come to liquidate the ghetto, then all stops are out and we fight to the end. And of course, they didn't know when the final liquidation was coming. They didn't have enough time, and the resistance misfired. It was very partial and very quickly overcome, and did not realize the hopes that they had put into it. So you had all of these problems about timing, about strategy, that were still there, that stood in their way. They faced other problems as well. As we have seen, most resistance movements in Europe gained their support both from a local population and from either governments in exile or governments in exile working with the Allies and persuading them to make arms drops and give logistical support. Now, both the Soviet Union made considerable arms drops to partisans behind the lines in the East, And the Americans and British made considerable arms drops to Yugoslavia, to France, to support partisans fighting there. No one was making arms drops to Jews in ghettos. They had no political standing. They had no prospect of being a player in the post-war game. And what many of those supporting partisan groups in Europe were doing was positioning a particular group to be the force on the ground that would first sabotage the Nazis when the Allied armies were approaching, and then be the political group to take power and provide for a transition away from a collaboration government with the Nazis to someone friendly to the Allies and helping to restore the government in exile after the war. So that virtually every other national resistance in Europe had at least one, if not two, groups who had the leverage of a political stake, that somebody was invested in their becoming the dominant resistant groups and the successor government when the Nazis were defeated. Jews fated to extermination and not having any national state had no leverage and no political, nobody was investing in their political future because they had no future. So that they're not going to have the kind of help. Arming a Jewish resistance was going to be a horrifically difficult task. That it was far more difficult for Jews to acquire weapons. They had to do it on the black market very expensively, and they had no one from the outside helping them. So the lack of both internal support, many of the underground groups had, as their armies were conquered, hidden caches of weapons, but their strategy was to wait, again, like in Poland, was to wait for the opportune moment, not to fire off prematurely. So the Polish underground is not interested in diminishing their stockpile of weapons by arming Jews in the ghettos when that's going to be a premature revolt and would mean that they'll have fewer weapons themselves at the key point when it is time for them to rise up. Now, there were two competing underground clusters, we might say, in Poland, which we have on the board. One is the AK, the Armia Krajowa. That was the underground group that was in contact with the Polish government in exile in London, the more conservative and nationalist Polish group. The AL, or the Armia Lublin, was the communist group set up to be loyal to the communist regime. The communist army will put in and install in Lublin, the first Polish city they get to. And so in Poland you have two different groups, and often different in terms of whether neither was, in a sense, give help to Jews as an independent Jewish resistance. The communists would allow, in some cases, Jews to join a communist resistance, not fighting a resistance as Jews. The Armia Krajowa was very often would not allow any Jews to join in any case. And we also have tragic cases where Jews seeking help from the Armia Krajowa were in fact considered a liability that would attract the Germans and were murdered by the Polish underground, particularly the most right-wing branch of the Polish underground. It is in fact a conglomerate. There is not a single organized group, but in fact spread over a spectrum. And the right wing of the Polish Armia Krajowa was very anti-Semitic and often murderous towards Jews hiding in the forest, that they didn't want to share a hiding place in the forest with any Jews that might attract Germans or that they didn't trust in any case. So you had Jews who had no help from within and no help from without, which meant that getting arms and for armed resistance was always going to be very precarious, very difficult. And Jewish resistance was always going to be underarmed. There were always going to be no chance that they would be adequately equipped to carry out a real kind of contest with the Nazis. So, given all of that, in a sense, the surprise, and in the end, is not that it was not that there was too little Jewish resistance, is that there was much at all, and we do know, in fact, now, thanks to those who started adding up incidences after Hilbert's book came out, that there was considerably more resistance, pockets of resistance, than we had known about before. But for most Jews, the obstacles of reaching that point were simply too great. Now, the most significant act, and the one that had the widest repercussions, would be the resistance of the Warsaw Ghetto, and that is what I will pick up with next Tuesday.